The ship groaned, a deep, weary sigh of timber and rope against the relentless crush of the waves. It was a sound a man could feel in his bones, a constant reminder of the fragile line between life and oblivion. On the sun-scorched docks of Sicily, a suffocating silence had fallen, thick and heavy as a shroud. This was no ordinary silence, but one pregnant with a terror yet unnamed. It clung to the salt-laced air, a scent of rot and unwashed linen that no man dared to acknowledge. From the ship's gaping maw, a single solitary bell tolled, its sound a slow, hollow echo that seemed to swallow the light. It was a monk, gaunt and wild-eyed, his face a parchment of fear and fever, clutching a rusted iron cross. He was one of the last still breathing, a solitary figure in a tomb of his own making. His breath was a ragged rasp, a final, desperate prayer to a god who had long since turned his back. On the ship's deck, the dead lay tangled in a grotesque embrace amongst bales of silk and barrels of olive oil. The rats, emboldened by the stillness, scuttled over their faces, their small, dark forms a living, writhing tapestry of the coming doom. The sound of their claws on the rough-hewn wood was the true herald of the plague, a drumbeat of destruction that only the dying could hear. The city, a distant silhouette of spires and shadows, watched from the safety of its shores. They saw a ghost ship in broad daylight, heard the lonely tolling of a single desperate bell. They did not know the name of the monk, nor of the disease, but they felt it, a cold, tightening knot of fear in their guts. He died, the bell falling silent forever, the iron cross slipping from his lifeless fingers. With him, the last warning was lost, drowned in the silence. The city, so soon to be his tomb, did not yet know its fate. The terror was not just in the death, but in the silence that followed. It was in the sudden absence of a neighbor's song, the unlit forge of a blacksmith, the cold hearth of a baker, a silence that spread faster than any rumor, colder than any winter. It was a silence that spoke of an emptiness that could not be filled, of lives extinguished with a cruel and casual finality. In the cobbled streets of Florence, the baker's cart, its wooden wheels groaning under a weight of a different kind, became the only sound. A lone man, his face shrouded in cloth, pushed it, a faceless shadow in a city of shadows. A child, small and still, sat on a doorstep, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn beads of a rosary. Her mother had been gone for 2 days. Her father, a cooper by trade, had collapsed at his workbench, a half-finished barrel his final poignant act. The child did not cry. Her face was a mask of an old, weary sadness, a wisdom far beyond her years. The rosary, a gift from her mother, felt cold in her small hand. She was a living testament to a city being consumed by a terror that could not be seen, a faith being tested to its breaking point. The church bells, once a joyful chorus marking the hours, now tolled without ceasing, each chime a funeral for a life cut short. The plague had a way of stripping away the grandeur of life, leaving only the stark, brutal truth of mortality. The scents of frankincense and burning herbs, once symbols of devotion and healing, now served as a futile mask for the stench of death that hung in the air. The child watched the baker, his movements slow and deliberate, a figure of silent, tireless grief. She was an observer, a tiny, forgotten piece of a world that was rapidly unraveling. The plague was not a storm, but a slow, creeping vine, choking the life out of every home, every street, every soul. It had no face, no army, no leader. It was a specter, a breath of cold air that turned the most vibrant city into a cemetery. In the quiet green valleys of England, in the village of Eyam, the plague arrived not with a fleet of ships, but on the folds of a tailor's cloth. It was a whisper, a subtle scent of dust and old spices that clung to a parcel from London. George Vicars, a humble man of needles and thread, opened the package, his mind on the coin it would bring. He dismissed the strange odor, for work was work and life before this had been simple. But soon a fever took him, a silent fire that burned from the inside out. The village, a close-knit community bound by shared hardship and shared faith, watched with a growing dread. The rector, William Mompesson, a man of God with a stern but loving face, made a decision born of desperate, heartbreaking love. He stood before his congregation, the scent of fresh-cut hay and fear thick in the air, and spoke. He declared that no one would leave. They would become a living tomb, a sacrifice to save the world outside. A collective gasp, then a heavy, suffocating silence. A young girl holding her father's calloused hand, felt the weight of his fear, a fear far heavier than the hand she held. The village of Eyam, once a place of simple joys, was now a cage, a last stand against an invisible, relentless enemy. The boundary was marked by a single, solitary stone, a silent promise. And in the heart of the village, a single lantern was lit, a beacon in the coming darkness. It was a defiant flame, a small, fragile spark of humanity against a tide of oblivion. The plague would take them all, but it would not take their hope. Not yet. The scent of frankincense and burning herbs meant to cleanse could not mask the sweet, cloying smell of decay. In the labyrinthine streets of Florence, a lone baker pushed a heavy wooden cart. The wheels, worn and groaning, sang a mournful song against the cobblestones, a rhythm that was all too familiar, all too final. It was a procession of the forgotten, the cart piled high with the bodies of those who had succumbed to the great sickness. A small child, no older than 6, sat on the cold stone of a doorstep, her home shuttered and silent. Her fingers, small and pale, traced the worn carvings of a rosary, a fragile lifeline in a world that had become unrecognizable. Her mother had been gone for 2 days. Her father, a cooper by trade, had collapsed at his workbench, a half-finished barrel, his final poignant act. The tools of his craft, the hammers, the saws, the iron hoops, lay scattered around his still form, a silent testament to a life cut short. The child, silent and still, simply waited. She watched the baker, his face a grim shadow beneath a shroud of cloth, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a phantom among the vibrant murals that adorned the city walls, a stark reminder of a world that was rapidly fading. The plague had a way of stripping away the grandeur, of reducing life to its most brutal, essential truths. The church bells, once a joyful chorus marking the hours of the day, now tolled ceaselessly, each chime a funeral for a life cut short, a prayer for a soul lost. The child did not cry. Her face was a mask of an old and weary sadness, a wisdom far beyond her tender years. The rosary, a gift from her mother, felt cold in her small hand, the wooden beads smooth from countless prayers. She was a silent observer, a living testament to a city being consumed by a terror that could not be seen, a faith being tested to its core. The city, once a vibrant tapestry of noise and color, was now a hollow echo of its former self. The shouts of street vendors, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children playing, all had been replaced by a suffocating silence, broken only by the mournful tolling of the bells and the relentless creak of the baker's cart. In the face of such overwhelming devastation, a new kind of piety began to emerge. It was not a faith of grand cathedrals and soaring hymns, but a desperate, bone-deep belief born of fear. Men and women, their faces a mixture of desperation and devotion, flocked to the churches, not for comfort, but for a last-ditch attempt at salvation. They carried relics. They lit candles. They offered prayers with a fervor that bordered on madness. They believed the plague was God's punishment, a divine scourge sent to cleanse a sinful world. They sought to atone for their imagined transgressions, to beg for mercy from a God who seemed to have abandoned them. They looked to the heavens, not with hope, but with a plea. But the prayers went unanswered, the pleas unheard. The plague did not discriminate. It took the pious and the profane, the rich and the poor, the young and the old. It was a ruthless equalizer, a scythe that cut down all in its path. The child on the doorstep, clutching her rosary, was a witness to this cruel truth. She saw the wealthy merchant, his silks and furs unable to save him, carried away on the same cart as the humble street sweeper. She saw the priest, his last rites nothing but empty words, fall victim to the very disease he sought to ward off. The faith of her parents, a simple, quiet belief, was all she had left. She did not know of God's wrath or divine punishment. She only knew of a silence that was growing, of a coldness that was spreading, of a world that was shrinking around her. The rosary, with its smooth beads and its promise of comfort, was her only solace. It was a tangible link to a world that was gone, a world of warmth and laughter and life. But even as she held it, a different kind of fear, a more insidious fear, began to creep in. It was the fear of being truly alone, of being the last one left. The cart's creak faded into the distance, and the tolling of the bells, once a sound of grief, now seemed to mock her solitude. The air, once filled with the promise of life, now smelled only of death. The The child, a tiny figure in a city of ghosts, was a symbol of a world teetering on the brink, a world where the old certainties of faith and community were being burned away, leaving only the stark, terrifying reality of survival. The next day, the baker would come again, and the silence would be even deeper. The village of Eyam, nestled within the quiet, green valleys of England, was a world unto itself. Before the summer of 1665, its days were marked by the simple rhythms of rural life: the lowing of cattle, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children playing in the fields. But the plague arrived not with a fleet of ships or a conquering army, but on the folds of a tailor's cloth, a whisper of doom carried on the wind. George Vicars, a humble man of needles and thread, opened a parcel from London. A strange smell, like dust and old spices, wafted from the package. He dismissed it, for the work was needed and the coin was good. But soon, a fever took him. The village, a close-knit community bound by shared hardship and shared faith, watched with a growing dread. The rector, William Mompesson, a man of God with a stern but loving face, made a difficult and fateful decision. He stood before his congregation, the scent of fresh-cut hay and fear thick in the air, and spoke. He declared that no one would leave the village. They would lock themselves away, a living tomb, to prevent the plague from spreading to the world outside. A collective gasp, then a deep, heavy silence. A young girl, holding her father's calloused hand, felt the weight of his fear. The village of Eyam, once a place of simple joys, was now a cage, a sacrifice, a last stand against an invisible enemy. The boundary was marked by a single, solitary stone, a silent promise. And in the heart of the village, a single lantern was lit, a beacon in the coming darkness. The decision was not made lightly. Mompesson knew the cost, the terrible price his parishioners would pay for their sacrifice. He watched as families, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and resolve, gathered their loved ones close. The village, once a place of open doors and shared meals, became a fortress of isolation. Neighbors, once friends, now kept their distance, their eyes filled with suspicion and fear. The plague, a silent predator, had a way of turning people against each other, of replacing trust with a cold, desperate pragmatism. It was a disease of both the body and the soul, poisoning the heart as it ravaged the flesh. The quarantine was not just a physical barrier. It was a psychological one, a wall built of fear and suspicion. The days bled into weeks, and the weeks into months. The scent of wood smoke, once a comfort, was now mingled with the smell of death. The burial bell, once a rare and somber sound, became a constant, mournful toll. The villagers, once so vibrant and full of life, became ghosts in their own homes. The young girl, her father's hand now cold and still, sat on the floor of their small cottage, her small face a mirror of the village's grief. She watched as her mother, her eyes red and raw with weeping, tended to her father's body, her movements slow and deliberate. The small, hand-carved wooden bird her father had made her, once a toy, was now her only companion. She held it tight, its smooth, cold surface a tangible link to a world that was gone forever. The plague did not discriminate. It took the young and the old, the pious and the profane, the rich and the poor. It was a ruthless equalizer, a scythe that cut down all in its path. The village, once a close-knit community, was now a collection of lonely, isolated souls, each one grappling with their own private horror. The rector, Mompesson, a man of God who had asked his people to make the ultimate sacrifice, was a living testament to the town's suffering. He buried his own wife, his hands trembling as he shoveled dirt onto her coffin. He stood alone in the church, his voice a solitary echo in the empty pews, his prayers a plea to a God who remained silent. He had asked them to make a sacrifice, and they had. Now, he wondered if it had all been for naught. The boundary stone, a silent promise to the world outside, was a constant reminder of their isolation. It was a symbol of their sacrifice, a testament to their love for their fellow man. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the wind howled through the empty streets and the distant cries of the sick filled the air, it also felt like a prison. The people of Eyam were not just dying. They were dying alone, their final moments unshared, their last words unheard. Their sacrifice was a magnificent act of love, but it was also a crushing burden of loneliness. The lantern, a small, defiant flame, continued to burn in the heart of the village, a beacon in the darkness. But for how long? The people of Eyam had made a choice that would echo through history, a choice that would define them. They had chosen to die so that others might live. But in the solitude of their sacrifice, they were left with a haunting question. Was it worth it? The answer, like the lantern's flame, was a fragile, flickering thing, lost to the wind. The air in the monastery was cold and smelled of stone and old parchment. It was a place built for silence, for reflection, for the quiet work of God. But now, it was a tomb. The silence was not peaceful, but a hollow, aching emptiness. Brother Thomas, his hands trembling, dipped his quill into the inkwell. He was a chronicler, a keeper of memory, but now his task was a chronicle of death. Outside the scriptorium, the mournful sound of the burial bell, a relentless rhythm of finality, filled the air. The monks, one by one, were succumbing. Brother Thomas wrote of the fever, of the black buboes that blossomed like grotesque flowers on the bodies of his brethren. He wrote of the prayers that went unanswered, of the pleas that went unheard. The ink, a deep, rich black, seemed to bleed into the parchment, a dark stain on the history of man. He wrote of Brother Bartholomew, a man known for his booming laugh and love of ale, who died whispering a psalm. He wrote of Brother Anselm, the quietest of them all, who passed in the night, a half-eaten crust of bread beside his bed. He documented not just the deaths, but the small, human details that were being lost to the great silence. The rustle of a robe in the hallway, the taste of watered-down wine, the weight of a crucifix in one's hand. He was the last one left, his quill a solitary weapon against the tide of oblivion. The last entry was brief, a single, shaky line, and I, too, feel the fever's heat. He was a witness, a keeper of sacred memory, and now he, too, would become a memory. The monastery, once a beacon of faith and knowledge, was now a fortress of sorrow. The once bustling library, with its rows of hand-copied scrolls and codices, was now silent, the knowledge within its walls a useless burden against the tide of pestilence. The gardens, once meticulously tended, were now overgrown and wild, a tangle of weeds and dying roses. The monastery was a microcosm of a dying world, a small island of order being swallowed by a sea of chaos. But even in this finality, there was a quiet act of defiance. Brother Thomas, in his final moments, was not just documenting death, he was preserving life. He was ensuring that the stories of his brethren, their small joys, their simple devotions, their peaceful deaths, would not be lost to the abyss of history. He was a keeper of souls, a final guardian of memory in a world that was rapidly forgetting itself. His work was not a chronicle of a plague, but a testament to the enduring power of humanity, of love, of faith. He was writing a final prayer, a final hymn, a final testament to a life lived in service. The last monk, his body racked with fever, his hand still clutching the quill, was a symbol of a world teetering on the brink. He was the last line of defense against the great silence, a lonely sentinel against the darkness. The ink, a deep, rich black, seemed to bleed into the parchment, a dark stain on the history of man. But in that darkness, there was also a flicker of light, a small, fragile spark of defiance. It was a hope that even in the face of such overwhelming devastation, memory, love, and faith could endure. And as his final breath escaped his lips and the quill fell from his hand, the last entry was made, a single, shaky line. And I, too, feel the fever's heat. The monastery, once a beacon of faith and knowledge, was now a fortress of sorrow. The once bustling library, with its rows of hand-copied scrolls and codices, was now silent, the knowledge within its walls a useless burden against the tide of pestilence. The gardens, once meticulously tended, were now overgrown and wild, a tangle of weeds and dying roses. The monastery was a microcosm of a dying world, a small island of order being swallowed by a sea of chaos. But even in this finality, there was a quiet act of defiance. Brother Thomas, in his final moments, was not just documenting death, he was preserving life. He was ensuring that the stories of his brethren, their small joys, their simple devotions, their peaceful deaths, would not be lost to the abyss of history. He was a keeper of souls, a final guardian of memory in a world that was rapidly forgetting itself. His work was not a chronicle of a plague, but a testament to the enduring power of humanity, of love, of faith. He was writing a final prayer, a final hymn, a final testament to a life lived in service. The last monk, his body racked with fever, his hand still clutching the quill, was a symbol of a world teetering on the brink. He was the last line of defense against the great silence, a lonely sentinel against the darkness. The ink, a deep, rich black, seemed to bleed into the parchment, a dark stain on the history of man. But in that darkness, there was also a flicker of light, a small, fragile spark of defiance. It was a hope that even in the face of such overwhelming devastation, memory, love, and faith could endure. And as his final breath escaped his lips and the quill fell from his hand, the last entry was made, a single, shaky line. And I, too, feel the fever's heat. He was the last witness, a keeper of sacred memory, and now he, too, would become a memory. He had not survived the plague, but his story, his final act of defiance had. It would be a testament to a world that was gone, a world of faith and community, a world that was now a ghost. The monastery was now a tomb, but the story it held, the final testament of Brother Thomas, would be a light in the darkness, a small defiant flame against the tide of oblivion. And as the sun rose over the silent monastery, a new age of darkness had begun. The stench of unwashed bodies and fear clung to the air in the crowded streets of London. The year was 1348, a time when the city's bells, once a symbol of time and ritual, now only tolled for the dead. A small girl, no older than 10, sat in the shadow of a stone wall, her doll clutched tight in her arms. Her name was Eleanor, and her family, a family of merchants, had all succumbed to the plague. She was alone. The city, once a vibrant tapestry of commerce and life, was now a silent, gaping maw. The streets, once bustling with vendors and knights, were now eerily quiet, save for the lonely, haunting cries of the sick. The doll, a small, wooden figure with a painted smile, was her only companion. She whispered to it, telling it stories of a world before the sickness, a world of feasts and laughter, of warm bread and the clatter of her father's coins. But even her small voice was swallowed by the silence. The plague had a way of stripping away the noise, leaving only the bare, terrifying truth of solitude. She watched as a cart pulled by a lone horse rumbled past, its contents a tragic cargo of her former neighbors. The man driving the cart did not meet her eyes. He had seen too much. Eleanor, her small frame a testament to resilience, pulled her cloak tighter against the chill. The city, once her home, was now a ghost town, and she, a tiny, forgotten specter in its midst. The plague was not just a sickness. It was a thief. It stole not just lives, but the very fabric of society. It shattered families, dissolved communities, and turned neighbors into strangers. The rich, those who could, fled the city, seeking refuge in their country manors. But the poor had nowhere to go. They were left to fend for themselves, to die in the cramped, filthy conditions that were a perfect breeding ground for the pestilence. The air was thick with a mixture of hope and despair, of whispered prayers and final screams. It was a world where a person could eat lunch with their friends and have dinner with their ancestors in paradise. Eleanor, with her doll and her memories, was a witness to this cruel and arbitrary horror. She saw the wealthy merchant, his silks and furs unable to save him, carried away on the same cart as the humble street sweeper. She saw the priest, his last rites nothing but empty words, fall victim to the very disease he sought to ward off. The plague was a ruthless equalizer, a scythe that cut down all in its path. It was a force of nature, a blind, unthinking monster that cared nothing for wealth, piety, or station. All it demanded was life, and it took it with a horrifying, insatiable appetite. The city, once so proud and defiant, was now a shell of its former self. The great London Bridge, once a bustling thoroughfare of commerce and life, was now a place of sorrow and dread. The Tower of London, a symbol of royal power, stood as a silent sentinel over a city of the dead. The great cathedrals, with their soaring spires and intricate carvings, were filled not with worshippers, but with the sick and dying, their pleas for mercy echoing in the hallowed halls. The city's pulse, once so strong and vibrant, had slowed to a near halt. Eleanor, alone on her doorstep, was the embodiment of this city's plight. She was a child, but she carried the weight of an entire world on her small shoulders. Her innocence had been stolen, replaced by a grim, silent understanding of mortality. She knew that the world she had known, the world of her parents and her friends, was gone forever. It had been replaced by a world of silence, a world of shadows, a world where the only certainty was the inevitability of death. As the sun set, casting long, mournful shadows across the empty streets, a new chill crept into the air, a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the coldness of a world without hope, a world that was slowly, inexorably dying. The wind, cold and cruel, swept through the empty halls of the castle. It was a mournful sound, a low whistle that sang of loss and desolation. The once grand tapestries, scenes of heroic hunts and joyous feasts, now hung limply, gathering dust like forgotten ghosts. The air was thick with the smell of old stone, cold ashes, and a silence so profound it felt as though the castle itself were holding its breath. Lady Eleanor, her face pale and drawn, clutched a single, rusted key in her hand. The key, a heavy, cold weight in her palm, was a symbol of a life that was no more. The plague had taken her husband, the lord of the castle, her 2 young sons, and nearly every servant. She was a queen of a kingdom of ghosts, a ruler of silence. Eleanor walked the halls, her footsteps a lonely echo in the vast emptiness. The great hall, once filled with the clang of swords and the laughter of feasts, was now a tomb of memories. She passed her husband's armor, a polished sentinel in the corner of the room, its reflection a distorted image of her grief. The key in her hand was to the treasury, a room full of gold and jewels. But what was gold in a world without people? What was a jewel when the world was dying? The wealth of a kingdom, once a source of power and security, was now nothing more than a hollow monument to a life that had been. The plague had a way of revealing the true nature of things. It stripped away the illusions of power and wealth, leaving only the stark, brutal truth of mortality. Eleanor, a woman who had once commanded a household of hundreds, was now alone, her only companions the memories that haunted every corner of her home. She was a widow, a motherless mother, a queen without a kingdom. The castle, once a symbol of her family's might and prosperity, was now a cage, a gilded prison of her own making. The walls, once a source of comfort and protection, were now a constant reminder of her isolation. She walked to the window, the cold glass a barrier between her and the bleak, empty courtyard. A single raven, a harbinger of death, landed on the windowsill. It cawed once, a harsh, guttural sound that seemed to mock her sorrow. Eleanor turned from the window, her hand tightening around the key. The treasure, she realized with a cold clarity, was not gold, but the memory of a life that was, and a grief that would last forever. She was a survivor, but what had she survived for? The question hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating weight. In the quiet hours of the night, when the moon cast long, mournful shadows across the empty halls, Eleanor would walk to the nursery. The scent of her sons, a mixture of milk and honey and wood smoke, still lingered in the air. She would run her hand over the small, wooden toys, the little lead soldiers, the hand-carved rocking horse. Each touch was a fresh wound, a new wave of grief. The silence in the room was a living thing, a palpable presence that screamed of what was lost. The plague had not just taken her children, it had stolen the very idea of their future, the possibility of their laughter, the promise of their lives. She was left with a key to a treasury of gold, but a heart that was a treasury of sorrow. The two could not be reconciled. The gold, with its cold, hard gleam, was a symbol of a world that had been, a world of power and ambition and earthly desires. But the sorrow, with its raw, visceral ache, was a symbol of a world that was now, a world of loss and loneliness and a profound, bone-deep grief. She was a woman caught between 2 worlds, the past and the present, and in the space between them, she was utterly, completely alone. And as she stood in the silence of the great hall, the key a cold weight in her hand, she knew that her grief was a treasure more valuable and more terrible than all the gold in the world. It was a treasure she would carry with her until her last breath. And so, in the silent, echoing halls of her castle, she began her life as a ghost, a living monument to a world that was gone forever. The small French village had a smell of its own, a mixture of freshly turned earth, baking bread, and the sweet perfume of wildflowers that grew wild along the riverbanks. But now, that familiar scent was gone, replaced by the acrid, choking smell of charred wood and smoldering cloth. The villagers, their faces streaked with soot and tears, watched as their homes, their history, went up in flames. The plague had arrived with a speed that left them breathless, a phantom enemy that left a trail of bloated bodies and empty houses. Their priest, a man of faith and fortitude, had made a decision born of desperation. He declared that the only way to save their souls, to cleanse the village of the pestilence, was to burn it to the ground. A collective wail of despair, a raw and guttural sound, rose from the crowd. A young woman, clutching a small, hand-carved wooden bird, watched as her home, the place where she had been born, where she had laughed, where she had loved, became a pyre. The small bird, a gift from her late father, was her only possession, a small piece of a life that was now gone forever. The flames, a cruel, vibrant orange, licked the sky, their heat a stark contrast to the cold dread that had taken root in her heart. She looked at her neighbors, their faces masks of shock and grief. They were a community of exiles, a tribe of refugees in their own land. The priest, his face grim, his hands clasped in prayer, watched the flames consume the village. He believed he was saving them, but the woman knew they were already lost. The ashes of fine gray dust would be their only legacy, a testament to a world that was gone forever. The fire, a cleansing flame, was meant to purge the village of the pestilence, but it also consumed their memories, their history, their very identity. The church, with its ancient stone walls and stained glass windows, was now a hollow shell, its bell silent forever. The marketplace, once a bustling hub of commerce and community, was now a field of smoldering ruins. The houses where generations had lived and died, where stories had been told and songs had been sung, were now nothing but ash. The villagers standing on the hill overlooking their burning home were a tableau of grief, a living monument to a world that was gone forever. They had been a community, a family, a people. Now they were just survivors, their past reduced to a pile of smoldering ruins. The young woman, her hand tightening around the small wooden bird, felt a cold sense of dread. She was not just mourning her home, but her entire world. The old ways, the old certainties, the old traditions, they were all being consumed by the flames. The plague was not just a disease of the body. It was a disease of the soul, a sickness that ate away at the very fabric of society. It was a brutal, indiscriminate force that cared nothing for faith, family, or community. All it demanded was life, and it took it with a horrifying, insatiable appetite. As the last flames flickered and died, and the smoldering ruins of the village were all that remained, a new kind of silence descended. It was not the silence of a peaceful night, but the silence of a graveyard. The villagers, their faces lit by the last embers of their homes, were left with a haunting question. What now? They had survived the plague, but at what cost? They had saved their souls, but they had lost their home, their history, their very identity. They were a people without a past, a community without a future. The woman looked at the small wooden bird in her hand, a fragile symbol of a world that was gone. She was a survivor, but what had she survived for? The ashes, a fine gray dust, would be their only legacy, a testament to a world that was gone forever. They were left with a choice, to rebuild or to wander, to try and reclaim a past that was now nothing but ash, or to forge a new future in a world that was unrecognizable. The woman looked at the bird in her hand, its smooth, cold surface a tangible link to a world that was gone. She knew that the old world was gone forever. It had been consumed by the flames, its memories reduced to a pile of smoldering ruins. The new world, a world without a home, a world without a history, was a terrifying, unknown place. And as she looked out at the vast, empty landscape, she knew that their journey, a journey of a people without a past, had just begun.